Dad was always a strange man. Strict, too. For a long time, I thought his odd ways came from being a single parent, but even that didn't quite explain his peculiar behavior. He had high expectations, my chores had to be done, rules had to be followed, and any misstep meant one inevitable punishment. He never raised a belt to me. Never struck me with his hand. He didn't ground me, take my things, or force me into timeouts. No, Dad had his own way of disciplining me. The jar didn't appear until I was 6, and even then, he presented it with deep, deliberate thought. I remember coming home after my first day of kindergarten to find Dad sitting in the living room. Beside him, on the little end table where magazines and knickknacks usually went, sat a jar. It was big, probably an old pickle jar, judging by the lingering scent of brine, and packed to the brim with speckled pinto beans, the kind I had glued onto construction paper for crafts at daycare. A piece of Scotch tape stretched across the glass, with my name scribbled on it in black marker. "Sit down. We need to have a serious talk," he said. Something in his tone unsettled me, so I plopped onto the floor, my legs crossed, staring up at him. Dad was usually playful. He made up bedtime stories, played pirates and astronauts with me, and even let me win at Mario Kart sometimes. But now, he looked like a judge about to pass a life sentence. "You're 6 now. Old enough to understand right from wrong. In this family, we use the bean jar for discipline. Do you see this jar?" he asked, though there was no way I could miss it. I nodded, and his lips curled into a small, approving smile. "The bean jar represents you. It holds everything you are and everything you might become. From now on, when you misbehave, disobey, or act out, I won't yell. I won't send you to your room. I won't do anything except remove a bean." At first, I almost laughed. A jar of beans? This had to be one of Dad's games. Like when he told me teddy bears kept closet monsters away or that the cavity creeps would gnaw my teeth into dust if I skipped brushing. Dad was full of tall tales. But something in his expression told me this wasn't a joke. He didn't break eye contact, his face void of amusement. "You're a smart kid, just like I was," he said, reaching into the jar. "But you need to understand what's at stake. This isn't just any jar." He pinched a single bean between his fingers, barely lifting it from the pile. And suddenly, impossibly, I felt something inside me shift. A hollow sensation, like a deep sadness creeping in out of nowhere. My stomach twisted, my chest tightened. I wanted him to drop that bean back in immediately. I needed him to. He must have seen the terror in my face because he let go, and the bean nestled back into the pile. The feeling vanished, but I was left shaking, struggling to understand what had just happened. "I'm sorry," Dad said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have to know the cost of disobedience. You're my last chance, and I need you to be perfect. The bean jar separates flaw from perfection. My father used it. His father before him. And his father before that. It will remain until your 18th birthday, or until all the beans are gone." I was panting now, a cold dread wrapping around me. What happens if all the beans are gone? He held my gaze, expression empty of warmth. "You don't want to know." And that was how it started. Dad didn't turn into some cruel monster overnight. After that talk, he was still the same dad, playing games with me, helping with my homework, making dinner. But every time I slipped up, he would turn silent, walk over to the jar, and remove a single bean. No yelling. No scolding. Just that mechanical act of punishment. He'd press the bean between his thumb and forefinger and crush it to dust. He enforced it for the smallest mistakes. Didn't wash my dishes. Lose a bean. Forgot to put away my clothes. Lose a bean. Stayed up past bedtime. Lose a bean. There were no warnings. No escalation. No difference between forgetting to pick up my toys and shouting at Dad in frustration. Each misstep meant losing one more piece of myself, ground into nothing between his fingers. And after, he'd look at me with that unreadable mix of pain and resolve, like this was hurting him, too. Each lost bean left me feeling fractured. Like something in me had been stolen. As a kid, it made me hyper-aware of every action. But I was still just a child. I forgot things, got lazy, tried to test boundaries. And every time, he caught me. Every time, I was punished. And every time, I felt that unbearable, hollow sensation creeping back in. I hated it. I hated losing beans. I trained myself not to slip up, to obey without fail. 5 a.m., start the laundry. 5:20 a.m., make breakfast. 5:30 a.m., wash my dishes. 5:40 a.m., get dressed. 6 a.m., clean my room. 6:30 a.m., backpack on, waiting by the door. 3:10 p.m., home. Homework. 4:30 p.m., clean house. 5 p.m., start dinner. 6 p.m., eat when Dad got home. 9 p.m., brush teeth. Shower. 9:30 p.m., bed. Every day, without fail. Because failure meant one less bean. And I couldn't afford to lose another one. It felt as if each bean were a piece of my psyche that he was turning to dust. As a child, every lost bean made me hyper-aware of my actions. But I was still just a kid, forgetful, impulsive, curious. No matter how hard I tried, mistakes happened. And each mistake cost me. I trained myself to be perfect. Not just good, flawless. My days became rigid schedules, precise and unyielding. 5 a.m., start the laundry. 5:20, make breakfast. 5:30, wash my dishes. 5:40, get dressed. 6 o'clock, clean up my room. 6:30, backpack on, fully dressed, waiting by the door. 3:10, get home, do homework. 4:30, clean house. 5, start dinner. 6, eat dinner when Dad got home. 9 o'clock, brush teeth, shower. 9:30, bedtime. Every day. No exceptions. Because exceptions meant losing a bean. This turned into a kind of mania. Chores weren't enough. Grades had to be perfect, too. What if Dad decided that B's weren't good enough? What if an A- was a sign of failure? So, I studied obsessively. Anything less than perfection felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath me. To the other kids, I was a weirdo. I didn't have friends. I had Dad, but it was a fragile, uneasy companionship, like living with a man who could turn on you at any moment. Then I met Cass. Cassandra Bigley wasn't a model student. Her parents pushed her, but her grades hovered around average. She came to me because I was the smartest kid in school, at least that's what everyone said, and she begged for my help. I agreed, tutoring her in math, science, English. And it worked. Her grades climbed, and with them, our friendship grew. She was my first real friend, the first person outside my home who cared about me without a set of rules hanging between us. Cass was also the first to hear about the bean jar. "So, he just takes a bean out and crushes it?" she asked one afternoon as we sat beneath the bleachers. "Yeah. And, what? That's it? It's just a bean." I hesitated. "It's more than that. When he crushes one, I feel." I struggled for the words. "Like something in my head is breaking. It's like losing a piece of myself." Cass frowned. "That's insane. What happens if he takes all of them?" "I don't know," I admitted, the words chilling me even as I said them. "But Dad says it would be terrible." Cass scoffed. "What's he gonna do? Ground you forever?" I shook my head. "I don't know. But I don't want to find out." She must have seen the fear in my eyes because her teasing stopped. Her expression softened, and then, without warning, she pulled me into a hug. I went rigid. No one had ever done that before, not like this. Dad hugged me, but his embraces were always measured, brief, practical. This was different. This was warmth and safety, an anchor in a storm I hadn't even realized I was caught in. A strange feeling welled up inside me, an ache, a longing. For what, I didn't know. Cass held me while I cried. I hadn't meant to, but it happened, and she didn't judge me for it. I realized then what I had been missing my whole life: comfort. Affection without consequence. A softness I had never known. After that, we spent even more time together. And for the first time, I started to see Dad differently. He was still the goofy, affectionate father I had always known, but the bean jar loomed over everything. It was the silent threat beneath our relationship, the thing that dictated my every move. And as I spent more time with Cass, I began pulling away from him. He noticed. His smiles became tighter, his questions sharper. I caught him staring at the bean jar, fingers tapping against the glass as if contemplating something. But he couldn't take a bean without cause. That was the rule. That was our deal. And I never gave him a reason. Still, there were moments when I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, of frustration. As if he were beginning to realize that the control he had over me wasn't as absolute as it once was. Despite everything, I don't think Dad was ever cruel. The bean jar wasn't a weapon of anger, not a tool to lash out after a bad day. He truly believed he was making me better, shaping me into something perfect. And in some ways, he succeeded. But fairness had never been part of the equation. And deep down, I knew that if the day ever came when the last bean was taken, it wouldn't matter if I thought it was fair or not. Because Dad was always a man of his word. Then, one day after coming home from Cass's, everything came to a head. Dad was supposed to be at work. That's what I had counted on. Cass and I had planned to come back to my place, unwind, and play some old-school video games. She'd never even seen a Super Nintendo before, and I wanted to show her how real Mario Kart was played. We were laughing as we walked inside, cracking jokes, completely at ease. Then, someone cleared their throat. The sound was sharp, unnatural, and it made my stomach drop. A cold chill crawled up my spine as I turned toward the living room. My father sat on the couch, rigid as stone, his hands resting on his knees. His expression was eerily blank, but his eyes were filled with something dark, something bottomless. It was the same expression he wore the day he first introduced the bean jar. "You come home late," he said, his voice low and steady, like a judge delivering a verdict. Your chores aren't done. Your homework is untouched. And you bring someone into my house without permission. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. I didn't see what it was until he placed it on the table, a single pinto bean. Before I could even register what was happening, he lifted a hammer and slammed it down. The bean shattered into dust. I let out a sharp gasp as a wave of nausea rolled over me. It was like something inside me had been physically torn away. I stumbled, clutching my head, the room swimming in front of me. The sensation was worse than anything I'd ever felt before. A raw, unbearable emptiness. And then, another crack. Another bean turned to powder. I collapsed to my knees, a sharp cry escaping my lips. My hands dug into my scalp as if trying to hold my mind together. It was too much. Too fast. He had lined up 4 beans, one for each infraction. Cass screamed. Stop it. Whatever you're doing to him, stop. He ignored her. He lifted the hammer again. Cass lunged forward, grabbing his wrist. What the hell is wrong with you? He turned on her in an instant, his face contorted with rage. Before I could react, he grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the door. This is your fault, he snarled. You've poisoned him. Made him forget who he is. I won't let you destroy him. You are never welcome here again. She struggled, shouting, trying to twist out of his grip. Let go of me. Something inside me snapped. Put her down. My voice was low, dangerous, so unlike me that even Cass stopped struggling. Dad froze. He turned his head, eyes locking onto mine. I saw something flicker there, something uncertain. Put her down. He hesitated. Just for a second. You dare. His voice trembled with something I couldn't quite place. You dare challenge me? He let go of Cass and stepped toward me, his face contorted in fury. You're just like the rest. I tried to save you. I tried to make you better. But you've been corrupted. If I have to, I'll crush every last bean in that jar. His hands shook as he reached for another bean. When all the beans are gone, you'll cease to exist. His fingers wrapped around it. And then, he gasped. His entire body seized, his face twisting in agony. His hands clawed at his chest, his mouth opening in a silent scream. His skin turned deep red, then purple, then nearly black. The hammer slipped from his grip and hit the floor with a dull thud. Then he was gone. Just like that. He hit the floor, unmoving. Cass was screaming, pounding on the door, shouting for help. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My ears were ringing. My body felt weightless, as if I, too, had begun to slip away. My father was dead. That was 2 years ago. I live with Cass now. Her parents took me in without question, and I've tried to put my past behind me. We're getting ready for college, making plans, trying to be normal. But something has been gnawing at me. The house, my house, is still there. I haven't been able to let it go. I thought selling it would help me move on. So I went back. Just to clear things out, to get rid of what remained of my father. The place was untouched, frozen in time. I moved through each room like a ghost, sorting through our old belongings, packing away memories. And then, finally, I stepped into his bedroom. The air was thick, stale. Dust clung to everything. I hesitated before opening the closet. Inside, lined up neatly on the shelf, were 5 jars. Each one had a name scrawled in my father's sharp handwriting. Jacob. Mark. Sylvester. Katie. James. I stared at them, my pulse roaring in my ears. They were empty. The lids were missing, the beans gone. Then, tucked behind them, was a 6th jar. This one was shattered, only fragments of glass remaining. The name on the tape was still visible. Maggie. A chill slithered down my spine. When the beans are gone, my father's voice echoed in my head, then you cease to exist. My stomach churned. These names, these people, who were they? Had they lived in this house? Had I known them? And if I had, why couldn't I remember them? And then, the worst realization of all. My mother's name was Maggie. I sat there, shaking, staring at the broken glass. If the names on those jars were real people, if their beans had been destroyed, then they had been erased. Erased from existence. Erased from my mind. I should have been relieved that my own jar wasn't empty. But instead, I felt sick. I took it. I don't know why. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of instinct. But before I left that house for the last time, I grabbed the bean jar and carried it with me. It sits on the shelf in my dorm room now. I don't know if it still works. I don't know if my father's death changed the rules. But I'm not taking any chances. I guard it jealously. Because if I ever lose the last bean, I don't think I'll be here to find out what happens next.